The Appalachian Mountains were the kind of place where the wind always seemed to carry secrets. It whispered through the pines, slid across old cabins, and vanished into valleys that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. In late autumn, the fog would come early and stay late, thick as milk, curling around the trees like something alive. That was the kind of fog people in those parts didn't trust, because it didn't just hide things, it swallowed them. Down in a forgotten pocket of the mountains, where paved roads turned to gravel and then to dirt, sat the small town of Carver's Hollow. It wasn't much of a town anymore, just a few houses, a boarded-up gas station, and a church that rang its bell every Sunday even though no one came. Most people who'd stayed behind were older, living off memories and the land. But on the edge of that quiet town, there was a house people rarely spoke about, the one belonging to the Ellis sisters. Nobody really remembered when the Ellis sisters had come back. Some said they'd inherited the land after their parents passed. Others swore they'd been gone for decades, and that when they returned, they weren't quite the same. There were two of them, Mara and Leela, both in their late 30s, though you wouldn't know it from looking at them. Mara had a kind of cold beauty that made people uneasy. Her face always looked like it was hiding something. Leela, the younger one, was the quieter of the two, always following a few steps behind, her eyes never meeting yours for long. They lived in that big old farmhouse that had been in their family for generations, the one with rotting porch steps and broken shutters that clapped in the wind. No one went there unless they had to, not because of what they'd seen, but because of what they'd heard. Strange noises at night, lights in the forest that flickered like lanterns and then went out, dogs that refused to walk past the gate. But it wasn't until men started disappearing that people began to wonder if the Ellis sisters' home was more than just a place of bad memories. Back then, before the story broke wide open, life in Carver's Hollow still had some rhythm to it. The men worked long days in the mountains, logging, fixing fences, or driving trucks between towns. The women handled what was left, tending gardens, watching kids, holding together homes that creaked with age. Everyone knew everyone else, and gossip traveled faster than the river that cut through the valley. The sisters kept to themselves, and that was fine by most. But people couldn't help noticing that every time a stranger came into town, someone passing through, looking for work, or just trying to escape their own ghosts, they always seemed to end up near the Ellis place. At first, no one paid attention. A drifter gone missing here, a farmhand who never came back for his pay there. The sheriff, old Ben Riker, chalked it up to the usual, people running from debts, bad luck, or worse. But there was something about the pattern, something quiet and deliberate, that made even him uneasy. The sisters had a way of smiling that didn't reach their eyes, and when they spoke, it always sounded like they were saying one thing but meaning another. Before it all began, Mara spent most of her days restoring the old house. You could see her out front, sanding the porch railings or painting shutters that never seemed to stay on. Leela, on the other hand, stayed indoors. Some said she was sick. Others said she was touched in the head. You'd catch glimpses of her through the window, staring out like she was waiting for someone or something to arrive. The air around that house always felt heavy, like the silence wasn't empty but listening. People tried to be kind at first. The Ellis family had always been respected once back when their father ran the lumber mill and their mother played piano at church. But time changes things. When the mill closed and the jobs dried up, families left and the sisters stayed behind, clinging to land that no longer held promise. That kind of isolation does things to people. It makes the walls feel closer, the nights longer. It was said that Myra didn't sleep much, that sometimes neighbors heard her walking the floors until dawn. The last man to be seen near the Ellis property before the disappearances became public was named Cole Anders. He was a drifter from Tennessee, tall, easygoing, with a kind of restlessness in his eyes. He came into town one afternoon asking for work and was told the Ellis sisters needed help fixing up their barn. He never made it out. When his truck was later found abandoned near the edge of the forest, the locals said maybe he'd just left, like so many others. But deep down, they knew better. You could feel something shifting in Carver's Hollow in those days. The air seemed colder. The woods grew quieter, as if holding their breath. The few who still ventured past the Ellis property spoke of the same uneasy feeling, the sense that they were being watched from behind the trees. And at night, when the moon was full and the fog rolled thick across the fields, you could see faint lights flickering near the old barn. Some said it was lanterns. Others swore it was something else entirely. The sisters themselves seemed unchanged through it all. Mara was calm, polite even, whenever the sheriff stopped by to ask questions. Leela barely spoke at all. But there was something about the way they looked at each other, like they shared a secret they'd never let slip, that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Whatever it was that tied those two together, it was stronger than fear, stronger than reason. For a long time, nobody dared to ask what really went on in that house. But people remembered the last thing Mara ever said before the truth came out. It was at the general store, just days before the next man vanished. She smiled that same cold smile and told the clerk, "Some men don't know when to stay away from what's not meant for them." At the time, it sounded like nothing more than a strange remark. But later, when the number of missing men reached 28, it would echo in everyone's mind. Because by then, Carver's Hollow wasn't just a quiet mountain town anymore. It was the center of a mystery that would turn the Appalachian fog into something far darker. A place where secrets didn't just hide, they devoured. The weeks after Cole Anders vanished passed in uneasy silence. The people of Carver's Hollow went about their lives pretending nothing had changed, but the air told a different story. It was heavier now, the kind that pressed on your chest and made you look over your shoulder for no reason at all. The woods that once felt like a neighbor now seemed like a threat. Even the animals had gone quiet. Sheriff Riker made a few trips up to the Ellis property after Cole's truck was found. Each time he returned with less certainty than before. Mara was always polite, offering him coffee she never drank herself. Leela stayed at the edge of the room, her eyes flicking between them like a bird waiting for a signal. When Riker asked about Cole, Mara said he'd left after 2 days. "Said he found work farther north," she told him, her voice smooth and calm. But something in the way she said it, too rehearsed, too careful, didn't sit right. Rumors spread the way they always did in small towns, fast and mean. Some said the sisters were hiding something on their land. Others swore they saw men going into the woods behind their house and never coming back. But talk was all it was, no proof, no bodies, no reason to dig deeper. That's what made it worse. People can make peace with a tragedy. They can't make peace with not knowing. Behind the walls of that old farmhouse, though, things weren't as calm as they seemed. The sisters had started arguing late at night. The walls were thin, and the sound carried down the hill to the road. Neighbors who passed by swore they heard shouting, sometimes crying. Once, someone claimed to have heard a man's voice too, but no one could be sure. Mara had always been the stronger one, or at least she believed she was. She was the decision-maker, the one who kept everything in order. But Leela had begun to change. She wasn't the quiet follower anymore. Something about Cole's disappearance had stirred something inside her, a guilt maybe or a longing she didn't understand. She'd grown restless, packing the house, staring at the woods for hours. She started leaving small offerings near the barn, old coins, dried flowers, scraps of paper with words only she could read. When Mara found them, she burned them all without a word. Money was running low. Whatever savings the sisters had from their family's land were almost gone. Mara had tried to sell a portion of the property once, but buyers backed out when they learned about the stories. So she turned to renting out small cabins on their land to travelers passing through. Men mostly, loners, laborers, men with nowhere else to go. She said it was just business, but Leela saw the way her sister watched them. Calm, assessing, almost hungry. At first, the arrangement worked. The men came, stayed a few nights and left, at least that's what people believed. But then another one vanished, then another, always without noise, without a trace. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate. Even Leela started to fear what was happening. She tried to ask Mara about it one night as the wind rattled the windows. "They're gone, aren't they?" she whispered. Mara didn't look up from her sewing. "Gone," she said simply. "And that's all that matters." The sisters' relationship began to crack. Leela started keeping to herself, sleeping in a separate room, locking her door at night. Mara didn't like that. She said families shouldn't have secrets. "Everything that happens here," she told Leela, "stays between us, you understand?" But Leela's silence grew heavier, filled with the weight of everything she didn't say. Around this time, the sheriff started digging deeper. Not because he had proof, but because the pattern was too clear to ignore. 28 men in 5 years, all travelers, all last seen near the Ellis property. He went back through old records, talked to nearby towns, and found a strange detail. Every man had responded to the same kind of ad. "Farmhand needed, room provided, must be able to work nights." The handwriting on each notice was identical. While the sheriff was piecing things together, Mara's control over Leela began to unravel. The younger sister had started talking to someone no one else could see. She'd sit out by the barn, murmuring into the wind as if the fog itself could hear her. Sometimes, Mara would catch her smiling at nothing, whispering names that didn't belong to anyone alive. Mara thought it was grief or madness, but Leela swore she could still hear the men. "They don't sleep," she told Mara once, her voice trembling. "They're still here in the ground. They talk to me when you're not around." That was the first time Mara struck her. After that, something changed in both of them. Mara became colder, more distant, as if hitting her sister had flipped a switch she couldn't turn off. And Leela stopped being afraid. She still whispered to the fog, left her strange offerings, but now there was a kind of calmness in her eyes. Like she had accepted something, Mara was still fighting to hide. Outside, pressures grew too. The town was struggling, jobs were gone, and resentment was thick. When people don't have enough, they start looking for someone to blame. The sisters, with their secrets and their land, made for easy targets. Some nights, teenagers from nearby towns would drive up to the Ellis gate, shouting, daring each other to go closer. One night, someone threw a rock through their window. The next morning, that same boy's car was found abandoned by the creek, keys still inside, doors wide open. He never came back to claim it. Sheriff Riker wanted to call for state investigators, but he hesitated. The Ellis sisters were the last trace of an old family name that once held power in those mountains. There were still people who remembered what their father had done for the town. Others remembered rumors about what he'd done to the women who worked for him. The Ellis name carried weight, dark weight, and Riker wasn't sure he wanted to stir up what lay beneath it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was festering in that house. On his last visit before everything broke open, he noticed scratches on the inside of the barn door, not animal marks, fingernails. When he asked Mara about it, she smiled. "Old wood," she said, "the kind that remembers too much." That night, a storm rolled in. Rain poured over the mountains, thunder shaking the windows. Inside, the sisters sat across from each other in silence. Leela's hands trembled as she tried to speak. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. "They know he knows." Mara's expression didn't change. "There's nothing to stop, Leela. This is how it's always been." Her tone was sharp, final. But Leela didn't back down this time. She looked her sister in the eyes for the first time in years. "No," she said quietly. "This is how you made it." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the storm outside pounding against the roof. Then Myra stood up and walked to the window. "You think they'll believe you?" she said softly. "After everything, you think anyone would believe you over me?" She turned, her voice low, calm, but shaking at the edges. "You don't even believe yourself half the time." That was the moment their bond shattered completely. From that night on, they became strangers sharing the same roof, each one watching the other, waiting for the first move. Leela began keeping a journal. She hid it under a loose floorboard in her room, filling the pages with confessions, memories, and the things she claimed to hear at night. "They whisper from the cellar," one line read. "They don't rest. They say Mara made promises." As winter came, the tension inside the house grew unbearable. Mara became paranoid, locking doors, boarding windows, refusing to go into town. The fog thickened again, staying longer each morning. People said it was just the weather, but others whispered that the mountain was reacting to something darker. By the end of that year, Sheriff Riker returned one last time. He came with a search warrant, 2 deputies, and a gut feeling that this visit would end differently. When they arrived, the house was empty. No sisters, no lights, only silence. The front door was open, and a faint smell, sweet and rotting, hung in the air. In the barn, beneath the floorboards, they found the first body, then another, and another. 28 in total, buried in neat rows like someone had cared enough to arrange them. Each one had something small in their hand, a coin, a flower, or a scrap of paper. The same kind of Leela used to leave by the barn. By then, the Ellis sisters were gone, vanished just like the men before them. Some said they'd fled into the mountains. Others believed something else had taken them. But those who lived in Carver's Hollow swore that when the fog rolls in thick and low, you can still hear 2 voices whispering from the woods, one calm, one trembling, and the faint sound of men calling back from underground. The story of the Ellis sisters wasn't just about what they did. It was about how people break when they're left too long in silence, how love can twist into control, how guilt turns into madness, and how secrets, once buried, always find a way to speak again. The storm that night was unlike anything Carver's Hollow had seen in years. The rain didn't fall. It slammed, pounding the roof so hard it sounded like gunfire. Lightning split the sky open again and again, turning the farmhouse white for a second at a time before dropping it back into blackness. The wind screamed through the broken shutters, and somewhere outside, the barn door banged against its hinges like something begging to be let out. Inside, the sisters were no longer speaking. Mara sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of her, her eyes distant and hollow. Leela stood by the window, clutching her journal against her chest like it could protect her. The house smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, something that had been there too long to be noticed anymore. Leela had reached her breaking point. For weeks, she'd been haunted by the faces of the men she said spoke to her in her sleep. Every night they came closer, their whispers filling her head until she could hardly tell where their voices ended and hers began. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think. And now she couldn't stay silent. "They know," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. Mara didn't look up. Who knows? "The sheriff, the town, the men in the ground." Leela's voice rose, breaking. "You think I don't hear them, but I do every night." Mara's hand tightened around the glass. "You're sick, Leela. You always have been. You see things that aren't there." Leela stepped closer. "You made me see them. You made me help you." The words hung in the air, heavy as the storm outside. For the first time, Mara looked up. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes sharp and empty. "You helped because you wanted to," she said quietly. "Don't pretend you didn't." Lightning flashed, lighting up the kitchen, the peeling wallpaper, the cracked window, the glint of something metallic on the table beside Mara's hand. A knife, small but sharp, the kind used for cutting rope or flesh. "I didn't want this," Leela whispered, shaking her head. "I just wanted them to stop." Mara stood, her voice steady but trembling underneath. "They only stop when you stop listening." But Leela didn't stop. She took another step forward, tears mixing with rain leaking through the ceiling. "They said your name, Mara, over and over. They said you made promises. They said you." "Enough," Mara slammed her hand down on the table. The glass shattered, scattering across the floor. The thunder swallowed her voice, but her face said everything her words didn't: fear, rage, and the loss of control she'd fought so hard to keep. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the rain hammering against the house. Then Leela reached for the knife. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. Leela grabbed it first, but Mara was stronger. They struggled, the chair tipping, the table sliding against the wooden floor. The candle fell, spilling wax across the boards. The house filled with their screams, raw, animal, unrecognizable. Mara's hand clamped around her sister's wrist, forcing the blade away, then toward her. Leela fought back with everything she had, clawing at Mara's arms, crying out her name over and over. But there was no reasoning left in either of them. Just survival. Just years of buried anger and guilt boiling over in one violent heartbeat. The knife found its mark, a sharp gasp, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. Leela stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock. She pressed her hand against her chest, blood blooming between her fingers. For a second, she didn't look in pain, she looked relieved. Mara froze, staring at what she'd done. The knife clattered to the floor. The sound was small, almost gentle compared to the storm outside. "Leela," she whispered, stepping forward. "Oh God, Leela." But her sister didn't answer. She sank to her knees, her body folding in on itself, her blood spreading in a dark pool across the floor. The journal slipped from her hand, pages fluttering open. Words written in shaky handwriting stared up from the paper. "They said the earth remembers everything." Mara fell beside her, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding, pressing against it even though she knew it was useless. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Don't you dare leave me." But the light in Leela's eyes faded, and the house went still again, so still that even the storm seemed to hesitate. Mara sat there in the flickering candlelight, her hands red, her breath uneven, and the sound of the rain outside turning into something that almost sounded like whispering. Then she heard it, a faint knock from the cellar. At first she thought it was her imagination, the wind, the storm, her guilt. But it came again, slow, measured, like knuckles against wood. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned her head toward the sound. The cellar door creaked at the edge of the kitchen floor. It shouldn't have been moving, but it was, inch by inch. Mara stood, stepping over Leela's body. Her mind felt split in two, one half whispering reason, the other sinking into panic. She picked up the lantern from the counter and held it over the cellar door. "Who's there?" she demanded, though her voice was barely a whisper. No answer, just that same knocking. Her hand shook as she reached for the latch. When she opened it, the smell hit her first: earth, rot, and something sour like old meat. She lifted the lantern, but the light didn't go far. The stairs disappeared into blackness. And then, faintly, she saw them, shapes moving just below the steps. Men, or what was left of them. Their faces were pale, their eyes open and empty, but their mouths were moving, whispering something she couldn't make out. Mara dropped the lantern. It shattered on the ground, flames licking at the wood. She stumbled back, slamming the door shut, her chest heaving. The fire caught fast. The whiskey on the floor from the broken glass fed the flames, and within moments the kitchen was glowing orange. Mara backed against the wall, staring at her sister's body, at the cellar door, at everything she had built coming undone in one terrible instant. Smoke filled the air, thick and black. She coughed, tears streaming down her face, not from grief now, but from the realization that this was how it would end. The house that had hidden every sin was finally taking them both. She dragged Leela's body toward the front door, but the fire was spreading too fast. The floorboards were already burning under her feet. She fell once, twice, clutching her sister's arm, refusing to let go even as the heat seared her skin. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the sound of cracking wood and her own ragged sobs. When the roof caved in, no one saw it. The house was too far from town, the road too flooded to reach. By the time the storm passed, all that was left of the Ellis home was ash, twisted beams, and the faint scent of something sweet and burnt. But the fire didn't erase everything. Beneath the floor of the barn, the ground had shifted, and the rain had washed away enough earth to uncover what lay below: rows of shallow graves, bones tangled in roots, and the rusted remains of tools used to dig them. In the days that followed, Sheriff Riker and his men arrived to find the ruin still smoldering. They found Leela's journal half-burned near what was left of the kitchen. In its final pages, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She said they'd never find us, but the mountain always keeps its own." The official report called it an accident, a lightning strike, a fire, a tragedy. But those who'd lived long enough in Carver's Hollow didn't believe that. They said the mountain took back what it was owed. And even now, on nights when the fog crawls low and the air tastes like rain, people swear they can still see two figures standing where the Ellis house once stood. One tall and still, the other swaying like she's waiting for forgiveness. And if you listen closely, they say, you can hear the faint echo of a whisper rising from the ground, calling the names of the men who never left. When dawn broke over Carver's Hollow, the storm had already passed. The mountains stood silent again, soaked and steaming as if nothing had ever happened. But when the smoke from the Ellis property rose into the morning air, curling over the treetops, everyone in town knew something terrible had ended, and something worse had begun. Sheriff Ben Riker was the first to reach the ruins. His truck stopped at the edge of the muddy road, tires sinking into the soft ground. The house was gone, nothing left but the frame of the chimney and a few blackened boards jutting up from the earth like broken ribs. The smell of ash and burnt wood mixed with something sharper, something human. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, before walking forward. The barn still stood barely. The doors were half open, the ground torn apart by rain. When Riker's boots hit the mud, they sank deep, and that's when he saw it, the first pale shape sticking up from the ground. A hand, then another. By the time the deputies arrived, it was clear what they had found. The investigation that followed lasted weeks, though most of the town didn't need a report to understand what had happened. Word spread faster than any newspaper could print it. The Ellis sisters were dead. 28 men had been buried on their land, and the mountain that had always whispered secrets now roared with them. For days, people came up the road to see the ruins. Some brought flowers, others came just to look, unable to believe that the two women they'd passed in the market could be capable of such things. The shock wasn't just about the deaths, it was about the lie that had lived among them for so long. The Ellis name had once meant power, history, and pride. Now it meant something else entirely. Old memories came back to life. People began talking about their father again, the quiet cruelty behind his charm, the way their mother had retreated into silence before she died. Rumors turned into patterns, and those patterns began to make sense. Maybe the sisters hadn't been born wicked. Maybe they'd been taught it. Maybe cruelty was the only language they ever truly learned. Sheriff Riker couldn't sleep. He'd spent years brushing off disappearances as bad luck, men on the run, drifters who didn't belong. He saw their faces now every time he closed his eyes. He could still smell the fire, hear the wet sound of shovels hitting soil as they unearthed bones that never should have been there. The guilt settled on him like fog, silent but heavy. He'd been too late, too blind, too trusting. The state investigators came, photographed what was left, took statements and collected evidence. But there wasn't much to take. The sisters' remains were burned beyond recognition, identified only by the rings found in the ashes, one engraved with the initials M.E. and the other Ellie. The journals were half destroyed, and what survived didn't explain much. Only fragments of Leela's handwriting trembling across the page. She said it would make us whole. She said they were chosen. The town held a memorial, though no one quite knew for whom. The men who'd vanished didn't have families there. Most were travelers, nameless to the locals. The Ellis sisters had no relatives left, no one to claim their memory. So the service became something else, a quiet reckoning, a way for the town to mourn its own blindness. People sat in silence in the church, the bell tolling for the first time in months. The preacher spoke about sin, about mercy, about the ways pain turns people into monsters when no one is watching. No one said Mara or Leela's names aloud. They didn't have to. Everyone could feel them in the walls, in the air, in the long shadow their story had left behind. The media arrived soon after. Reporters from the cities called it the Appalachian widow murders, though neither sister had ever been married. They printed stories filled with speculation, dark rituals, madness, revenge. They turned the sisters into something larger than life, stripping away the humanity that had once been there. Some saw them as monsters. Others saw them as victims of their own history. Either way, they became legends. Tourists started coming months later, driving up the mountain to see the place where it all happened. They'd park by the edge of the road, take pictures, and whisper about ghosts. Someone even built a small sign near the ruins. The Ellis sisters' house, do not trespass. It didn't stop anyone. People always want to be near tragedy, as if standing close enough might make them understand it. Sheriff Riker eventually retired. He never spoke about the case again. Some said he moved to another state, others claimed he stayed, living alone near the river. But before he left, he visited the site one last time. The grass had grown back by then, tall and green over the old foundations. The barn was gone, torn down after the search ended. He stood there in the quiet, listening to the wind move through the trees. For a moment, it almost sounded like voices. He closed his eyes, said a prayer under his breath, and walked away. For the people who stayed in Carver's Hollow, life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, though nothing ever truly felt normal again. The town's silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was uneasy, watchful, like it knew what had happened there and refused to forget. Parents warned their children not to wander near the woods. Travelers no longer stopped to ask for work. The Ellis name faded from conversation, but never from memory. Years later, when someone tried to rebuild a house near the old property line, the foundation kept sinking. No matter how many times they filled it, the earth seemed to swallow it back. Some said it was just bad soil. Others said the mountain was making sure no one lived there again. As time went on, stories twisted into myths. People began saying that on foggy nights you could see two women walking along the ridge, their figures faint against the mist. One carried a lantern, the other a book. Sometimes, they said, you could hear the faint sound of men calling from far below, their voices rising with the wind. No one could prove any of it, but no one tried to disprove it either. Some things were better left alone. The Ellis sisters' story became a cautionary tale whispered to outsiders, about what happens when people keep too many secrets, when isolation becomes madness, when guilt festers until it turns into something else. The town had survived, but it had changed. It had learned that evil doesn't always arrive with strangers. It can live quietly in familiar faces, in quiet homes, and in the silence of a place that looks too peaceful to question. In the years that followed, every so often someone would find something near the ruins, an old coin, a rusted tool, a piece of charred wood still smelling faintly of smoke. Small reminders of what once stood there. But the strangest discovery came from a hiker one summer evening. He found a jar buried just beneath the soil, sealed tight with wax. Inside were scraps of paper, burned at the edges, water-stained, but legible enough to read. They were written in two different hands. Leela's writing was trembling, filled with guilt and fear. They told me to stop. They said we had taken too many, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was for us. And Mara's steady, sharp cold. They were never meant to leave. The mountain chose them, not me. After that, the jar was taken to the sheriff's office, locked away in a drawer that was never opened again. The Ellis sisters were gone, but the questions they left behind still lingered. What drove them to do it? Was it madness, survival, revenge, or something older, something born from the mountain itself? No one could say for sure. But in Carver's Hollow, where fog still creeps through the trees and the wind still carries faint whispers through the pines, people remember. And when they tell the story, they don't speak of monsters or ghosts. They speak of sisters, two women who were once like anyone else until the silence of the mountains swallowed them whole. When the final report on the Ellis sisters' case was filed, it was less a document of answers than a ledger of questions, each line an echo of what could never truly be known. The state closed its investigation quietly. There were no trials to follow, no confessions to examine, no perpetrators left to face a judge. The fire had seen to that. What remained was the debris, the bones, the journals, and the long shadow of silence that hung over Carver's Hollow for years afterward. The official statement listed the case as resolved by the death of the suspects, but no one in town ever called it resolved. You can close a file, but you can't close a wound. For the people who had lived through it, the few who had loved the sisters or at least believed in their goodness, the years that followed were a slow, quiet reckoning. The crimes had ended, but the aftermath never truly did. The weight of what they had done, and what everyone else had failed to see, settled into the bones of the town like winter frost. Sheriff Ben Riker carried the guilt until his final days. He, grown up alongside the sisters, had known their father, had turned his back on rumors because he wanted to believe in the best of people. In the years after the fire, he spent most of his time alone, keeping notebooks filled with small, cryptic entries. She said they were chosen. Leela wanted to stop. Did we make them? He never forgave himself. When he died, they found a letter among his papers addressed to no one in particular. We always say evil hides in dark places, but maybe it hides best in the light, in people who seem kind, in families that look proper. Maybe that's why no one ever sees it coming. The letter was never published, but people in town spoke of it often. Some saw it as his confession, others saw it as wisdom earned too late. The few survivors connected to the Ellis family, the cousins who lived 2 towns over, a childhood friend who had once worked their land, moved away quietly. The Ellis property was condemned and eventually fenced off. The remains of the house were left untouched. The land was declared unsellable after several buyers pulled out, claiming uneasy feelings or unexplainable noises during visits. The mountain, it seemed, refused to let go. In the years that followed, Carver's Hollow changed in ways that couldn't be seen from the outside. People spoke more softly. They looked at one another longer before trusting. The town's sense of safety, the quiet belief that evil was something that happened elsewhere, had been shattered, and from that fracture grew a new kind of awareness. Teachers began speaking more openly about isolation, abuse, and mental illness. The church held counseling sessions instead of sermons once a month. Even the sheriff's office changed its policies, no more dismissing missing persons as drifters or runaways. Every name mattered now. In a strange, painful way, the Ellis case forced Carver's Hollow to confront itself. The town's long-standing code of silence, its tradition of minding your own business, had created the perfect breeding ground for tragedy. The sisters' crimes were monstrous, yes, but they had also been invisible for so long because no one dared to look. And that became the bitter lesson. Evil doesn't thrive because it's strong. It thrives because no one stops it soon enough. Outside the Hollow, the story spread like wildfire. Documentaries, podcasts, and novels emerged, each trying to dissect the psychology of the Ellis sisters. Experts debated whether they were sadists, survivalists, or victims of generational trauma. Reporters camped near the ruins for months, eager to capture the haunted mountain on film. But the public fascination carried its own cruelty. For those who had actually lived through it, seeing their tragedy turned into entertainment felt like being stripped bare again. The townspeople learned that horror sells, and that once a story leaves your hands, it never really belongs to you anymore. Eventually, the attention faded, as all sensations do. The world moved on to newer horrors, fresher scandals. But in Carver's Hollow, the silence remained, a memorial more enduring than any headline. Was justice served? It depends on who you ask. There were no trials, no sentences, no final words of repentance. The Ellis sisters escaped the law through fire and death, leaving behind only the consequences of what they'd done. To some, their deaths were punishment enough, proof that evil devours itself. To others, it felt like an evasion, an ending without accountability. But perhaps justice in its truest form existed not in the courtroom but in the aftermath, in the way their story forced people to change, to confront the rot beneath their own civility. The law had failed them all, but awareness, however painful, had begun to take its place. The sisters' victims, though nameless to history, became the town's unspoken saints. Their graves, once lost in the fields, were finally marked. Wooden crosses lined the edge of the forest where they were found, 28 in total. No names, no dates, just silence and the wind through the grass. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, someone leaves flowers there. No one ever says who. Looking back now, the story of the Ellis sisters has become more than a crime. It is a reflection of how power, isolation, and silence intertwine to deform human souls. It asks a question no one wants to answer. What happens when pain becomes a kind of faith? Mara and Leela Ellis were not born monsters. They were shaped by the very forces that once protected them: family reputation, social standing, inherited pride. They learned early that appearances mattered more than truth, that silence was safer than honesty. And in that silence, they found their undoing. The case exposed not just the cruelty of two women, but the complacency of an entire community. It revealed how easily morality can be bent when it's inconvenient, how quickly people look away when something feels too strange to be true. In a world that loves to separate good from evil, their story remains a stubborn reminder that the line between them is thin, shifting, and often invisible. Decades later, Carver's Hollow is quieter still. The road to the Ellis property has been swallowed by weeds. The sign warning trespassers has rusted away. But the locals still tell the story to outsiders on cold nights when fog gathers low and the woods seem to listen. They tell it not as a ghost tale, but as a lesson, one written in fire and ash. They say that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. Sometimes it sounds like laughter from a window on a lonely hill. And sometimes it begins with love twisted too tightly around fear. As one old resident once said, standing near the crosses on the ridge, "We thought the mountain was cursed, but maybe it was just showing us what we really are." That perhaps is the truest ending to the story of Mara and Leela Ellis, not justice or redemption, but reflection. A mirror held up to human nature itself, showing that beneath our gentleness and faith lies something ancient and unbroken, the capacity to destroy and the desperate hope to be forgiven. And as the sun sets behind the hollow, painting the trees in a fading red glow, the silence that follows feels almost sacred. Because in that stillness, between the echoes of what was and the quiet of what remains, rests the uneasy truth that no one can bury forever.